Hi there. My name is Ophelia. I'm part of Integrity, and this week we are doing a bit of a takeover on the FIA Instagram account. So welcome to you. This is Data Week. We're very excited to be partnering with the Fundraising Institute of Australia on this week. To give you a little bit of an intro, Integrity is a digital marketing and fundraising agency. We focus on digital strategy, on digital performance, and on next generation fundraising. So that obviously includes a lot of digital campaigns, a lot of digital always-on fundraising, things like regular giving programs, and so on. Today, to be joined by Integrity's technology strategist, Kevin Mock. Kevin is about to join. He'll be on the call in just a second. And today we're going to talk specifically about cookies, their role in segmentation, their role in targeting, and what shifting regulations on privacy means for Australian organizations in particular. Good morning, Kev.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Very good, very good.
Excellent. Kev, so we're talking about cookies today, and as viewers might notice, I have a North American accent. I'm from Canada, and over there in Canada, in the US, but especially if we look at Europe, there's a lot of talk about tracking and cookies, and then we look at Australia, and it's not a topic that we talk about so much. Why is that? Why are we talking about cookies today, and why do we talk about it so little in Australia?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you've been browsing the internet, you've probably seen many websites that have this pop-up that says, will you be consenting to cookies? And that's predominantly has been driven by Europe and the GDPR. And look, if you're an organization that's in Australia and you maybe a small to medium, maybe even large organizations, and you serve predominantly Australian audiences, you've probably never had to worry about this little pop-up. So we're a bit lucky in that sense. But, you know, there's probably a bit of a movement now, you could say. I'm not sure if you caught that Four Corners report yesterday, but, you know, data is becoming more and more of a sensitive topic for users. And actually, a Cisco study recently showed that they interviewed a bunch of respondents and just about data and data sensitivity, and 80+% of that respondent basically answered saying that they are really concerned about how organizations use their data, and they really do want to maintain more control of it. And that 80% of that group also said that they're willing to swap organizations if they think that that organization isn't managing their data ethically. So, you know, cookie comes into this because cookie is a method of tracking user behavior when it comes to online. So organizations do need to be prepared because, you know, we may not be in a position in a couple of years time where Australia still has sort of lax cookie policies when it comes to tracking and websites online.
You mentioned lax policies in Australia, and when we look at global policies and policies in different countries, Australia is an outlier among Western nations. We really hear about some very, very tough regulations in specific places, in particular in Europe. So you mentioned GDPR. I'll have you talk about that a little bit, and in the US. So can you give us sort of not a ranking, but an overview of what those policies look like globally?
Yeah, so GDPR is probably the gold standard when it comes to data protection and data privacy. So it really just gives the user way more control over the data that organizations are collecting, using, and what they're sort of storing on users. So it's probably one of the strictest, you could say, in the world right now. And then you kind of go down that sort of totem pole. We go down to maybe the states that have they don't have anything nationally, but California has a regulation that affects Californian residents, which almost sort of applies to a lot of the rest of America. So it's not as strict as GDPR, but it kind of gives a bit of power to the user to allow them to choose, to ask the organization to delete any data that they might have, to ask whether their data is being sold, and that sort of thing. And then you kind of go down, and then Australia's probably right there, sort of being a little bit more relaxed when it comes to data privacy. But if we do look across to our neighbours in New Zealand, they've actually amended their privacy policy actually in 2020 in December. So it was actually quite recent. And they were actually quite more in line with what we were operating at in terms of their privacy policy. So now their privacy policy is the Privacy Policy 2020, which is now a bit more in line with the GDPR. Definitely not as strict, but it does give a lot more power to users when it comes to, knowing what organizations are doing with the data and, how they're sort of using the data and how they're collecting it, and really prevents organizations to collect data in an unethical way.
Mm. So it sounds like Australia's regulations are much less strict than overseas. We're starting to see a shift, and you mentioned New Zealand in particular. So why should Australian organizations care? Is it something that would have been on the radar? And what are some things that we might start seeing as part of that shift?
Yeah, I think that, we're very lucky. We're getting a bit more lead time as organizations in Australia to start thinking about this, but it would be naive to really think that it's going to stay like this forever. Our neighbors in New Zealand have already started to implement stricter data privacy laws. There's society influence around people wanting more control over their data. So it's only a matter of time before Australia follows suit in terms of increasing that visibility around how organizations manage data. So this is important because once that comes into effect, at a very base level, cookie consent is going to be one of the first things that you're going to be thinking about. Luckily, there's going to be a lot of case studies and a lot of use cases of people doing cookie banners well. So we'll kind of be in a much better position when it comes to that point. But if you don't, as an organization, implement that well, you could be losing out on a lot of valuable information. So if you think about your own user behavior, for instance, when you see a cookie banner pop up, it's very likely that you're going to ignore it or hit decline. And that kind of actually shows in a lot of the research where only 11% of people actually actively consent to cookie banners. So that means you've got over 80% that are ignoring that or declining that. And what that means is that impacts things like your harmless cookies, like Google Analytics. So when you're using, Google Analytics, that sort of thing, that's actually a cookie that gets disabled along with that banner. So we've seen clients lose 90% or lose visibility of 90% of their user traffic in a matter of weeks because of that. So you do need to start planning, how that will impact your organization and your analytics and even advertising for fundraising when it comes to remarketing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned retargeting, because when we look at a fundraising campaign, very, very frequently, one of the things we look at is how do we reach people who are already connected to our organization, people who already have either are part of our email database or have visited our site before, and maybe even who've donated before or who abandoned the donation process halfway through. So this idea of not being able to use cookies or to track them to then put together a retargeting campaign, that's going to have a lot of impact on the way that we plan campaigns, the way that we measure campaign results, and even the way that we allocate budgets and make kind of longer term projections. So given that that regulations are changing around the world, that we're starting to think that might change in Australia in the next couple of years, what do you think that might look like? Are we thinking that it would be quite a strict policy, like GDPR style, something a little bit more in the middle like New Zealand, or more like the US and Canada being much more lax in their policies?
Yeah. I mean, if I had to make a prediction, we could look to our sort of neighbours in New Zealand, being, I guess, a bit of an upgraded policy from their previous privacy policy. And then we can kind of look at GDPR as the sort of gold standard. I would think that Australia would probably land somewhere in between the two there over the next couple of years. And I definitely don't think we'll sort of be operating business as usual forever, but yeah, somewhere in between the GDPR and the New Zealand privacy policy is definitely something I think will happen over the next few years.
Yeah, earlier this year we saw the government take quite a hard stance against tech companies. So
Mm,
Google and Facebook in particular. If we go back to the media codes that were being legislated and implemented, and then the reaction from media companies. So certainly we're looking at Australia as not shying away from taking on tech companies, and then things like privacy policies and cookie policies being maybe part of that, or maybe some collateral damage. So if we're looking at all of this, how do we recommend that organizations prepare themselves? What are some things to be aware of in the lead up?
mhm. Yeah, well, I think first and foremost is really understanding what your cookies are doing at the moment. If you were to disable your cookies tomorrow, what kind of impacts will cookies have on your overall organization? Will you lose your tracking and will you lose your tracking through Google Analytics or any other analytics platform? Will you lose your remarketing lists, your remarketing capabilities? You need to, first step is really just understanding the impact of losing cookies within your organization. I think the next thing to really start to hone in on and think about is how do we start to prepare our data or leverage our data without the use of cookies. So looking at things like making sure that your own data, your first party data is clean and comprehensive. And if you're building a strategy over the next 3 years, really start to think about how you could build in resources and considerations for database and database maintenance, whether that's, having database consultants, having database and data engineers, or just even just having just a data warehouse, just to have a clean place to store all your segmented data. First party data is going to be really, really important when it in the future. So other things just to be aware of is start thinking about how you can start collecting data in an ethical way without, if cookie were to discontinue in the future, thinking about emails. Emails is going to be the number one data point or data source that you can get from a user. So start thinking about how you can integrate that into your campaigns to exchange, exchange value for that email, and start building, nurture journeys within your database to develop stronger relationships with your audiences.
Mm. Yeah, one that reminds me of a project that we're working on at the moment. So with a client that for years has really relied on their Facebook page and even advertising and retargeting, not so much for fundraising, they're not a fundraising organization, but for reaching their services clients and announcing things like new services available or disruptions to services due to COVID. They haven't looked to their email list at all, so that they haven't invested over the years in growing that email list, nurturing that email list. Again, not talking about converting to a donation or to regular giving, just to keep that point of contact. And so now we're working with them closely and advising them on how do you do that. And as always, the best time to start is, 10 years ago. The second best time to start is today. So it's not hopeless. There's a lot of work, but if it's not something that's maybe that you're facing as an organization today, I would strongly encourage you to start thinking about it sooner rather than later. Speaking of planning ahead, so if you've been on the internet, if you've looked at any kind of business publication in the last year, you would have heard about this rumored post-cookie world, so the cookie apocalypse. Kevin, what does that mean? Should we be concerned? Cookie apocalypse kind of sounds delicious, but should we actually be worried about this? What does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does sound delicious, but we definitely shouldn't be too concerned. The short answer is probably don't worry. But yeah, I think the cookie apocalypse really refers to when Google Chrome or Google turns off third-party cookies on their browser Chrome. So they actually own the majority of the browser share market at the moment. So they're the dominant browser that most people are using. So for the most part, cookies are still alive and well at the moment, but they do plan to essentially turn them off. With all the pushback from the data privacy and the sensitivities around that, they have a plan to turn off cookies it was in 2022, but they've actually pushed that back recently to late 2023. So right now they're sort of trying to figure out a way through their program called Privacy Sandbox to essentially have cookie tracking without cookies. So I guess a lot of the fear around losing cookies is everything that we've talked about so far, right? So the loss of analytics, the loss of remarketing and advertising. And I think for Google, that's one of the biggest sticking points, is that if they disabled third-party cookies without any planning, they would lose a big part of their advertising revenue, because advertisers would no longer be able to advertise with them, essentially. So their goal is to create a world where Privacy Sandbox allows for cookie tracking without cookies, essentially. So I think short answer is no, we probably don't need to be concerned, but it is going to be still really important for organizations to think about their first party data. Collecting those emails, they're so easy to collect and relatively cost effective to collect. So we want to perhaps live in a state where we're less reliant on Google's policies or Google's cookies, and I guess rely more on our own cookies, so to speak, and our own first party data. So yeah, it's going to be important to still be thinking about that, even though, Google advertising is probably not going to go anywhere anytime soon, but it's important to still think about your first party data.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for this. It was fascinating to talk a little bit more about this, to maybe dispel some of the rumors and some of the panic around cookies, but also just to understand a bit more why it's so important to take a good measured look at what the impact might be, the impact of these changes might be on our strategies. If you are watching this and you have any questions, if you're curious about what you should be doing as part of your data strategy, or if this is the first time you're hearing about this and you're feeling a little concerned, I'd encourage you to reach out to us at Integrity. So you can find us on Instagram at NTEGRITY, or look us up on Google. We're available on our website, and we're not breaking any policies with our cookie use. We are compliant with all Australian policies for tracking. Kevin, thanks again for joining me today, and thanks so much to FIA for hosting Data Week. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. See you soon.
See ya.